Hey guys, tonight we slip on our stiffest collars, take a whiff of coal smoke, and squint through the sooty fog of Victorian England. Imagine you're in the bustling heart of London. Damp cobblestones click beneath polished boots, horse-drawn carriages rattle past, and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoes between narrow brick lanes. You weave through crowds in top hats and threadbare bonnets, dodging puddles that aren't always water. Everyone seems to know where they belong. You, though, you're standing out already. Maybe it's your confused glancer, your trendy sneaker sand. I'm sorry to say this, but you probably won't survive this. Not unless you're prepared to know your place and never, ever stray from it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you think you'd tough out high society, the soot-streaked alleyways, let me know your location and what time it is for you down in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're waking up on a scratchy straw mattress, in a room so cold you can see your breath, or maybe you're padding across thick Persian carpets in your private townhouse, because in Victorian Britain, where you were born decides nearly everything about your day. Strict social classes aren't just a weird cultural quirk, they basically define reality. Nobles and aristocrats glide through drawing rooms, the middle class fret over manners and mortgage payments, while working folk are elbow to elbow in cramped factories or crammed into smoky cellars. There's even a handy guide. Queen Victoria herself is tucked at the tippy top, and you can trace society all the way down to the invisible children sweeping chimneys. You might admire the period aesthetic from movies' ruffled dresses, shiny carriages, complicated mustaches, but let's be honest, unless you were born to it, you're not getting through that iron door labelled exclusive. Feeling out of place yet? That's probably because even a polite hello could brand you as trespassing. One scholarly debate that always gets the experts fired up. Historians still argue whether the upstairs-downstairs boundary was ever truly crossable. Sure, there are stories like Lord Alfred and his secret marriage to the scullery maid, or Miss Turner, who inherited a shipping fortune and scandalized the neighborhood by inviting commoners to tea. But by and large, you're better off learning your invisible leash unless you fancy a tongue lashing from Lady Millicent or a bucket of chamber pot contents dumped from above. Picture this. It's breakfast. If you're working class, it's yesterday's bread, maybe with a streak of lard if you're lucky. If you're genteel, there's a strict sitting order at the long table and good luck grabbing a kipper out of turn. Upper-class children are still dressed and spoken to by nanny-sadults only emerge for lunch, and you'd best not forget to bow and never, ever eat before her ladyship unless you want to be banished to Siberia. And no, I'm not joking. But here's the quirky bit. Victorian etiquette manuals were so detailed that some included diagrams for how to properly incline your head. Practicing bows in your bedroom mirror isn't just for Bridgerton fans, it was real Victorian prep work. Even fashion is governed by unspoken rules. Silk hats for bosses, battered caps for workers. If you, a visitor with sneakers, gasp, dared to stride through Regent's Park, you'd gather stares so intense you might spontaneously combust. There's a fringe theory that a spontaneous combustion epidemic actually occurred, fueled by layers of flammable petticoats and patent medicines, but perhaps best to blame awkward Victorian fireplaces instead. Historians still argue about whether these horror stories were heartfelt warnings or just a creative way to explain why that one cousin's disappearance was never solved. All this means that knowing your place isn't just an expectation, it's survival. Slip, and you might lose connections, respect, even your job, or, at the very least, your breakfast. If you're dreaming, you might work your way up. I hate to break it to you. Social mobility was about as slippery as a Victorian bathtub, if you even had one. More often, you just stayed put, clutching your teacup while eyeing your betters with envy and the servants with suspicion. But sometimes, people did break the mold by preposterous luck or scandal. Take the case of Sarah Forbes Bonetta, a West African princess brought to England as a gift to Queen Victoria. She later became a celebrated goddaughter of the Queen herself. It's a strange, true story, quirkier than most fiction, and it highlights just how rare and weird those upward leaps really were. Most folks never had that chance. On especially tough days, you might think, I'll just be myself. But in Victorian times, standing out was a punishable offence. It's a bit like attending a friend's wedding in a dinosaur costume, but with way more serious consequences than being politely escorted out. Jokes aside, you'd have a hard time fitting in. Scrape off the dirt, mind your accent, and keep those feelings bottled so tightly that even a bottle of ginger beer wouldn't fizz. Ginger beer, by the way, was sometimes laced with a hint of opium to soothe the nerves, according to society folks who'd never, under any circumstances, let working-class hands touch their plates. Historians still argue whether these intoxicating comforts were a way for the upper crust to keep calm in a changing world, or just a symptom of collective Victorian stress, brought on by all that effort to stay in one's lane. Either way, just knowing your place wasn't enough, you had to prove, day after day, that you deserved to hold it. That kind of pressure makes modern-day high school popularity contests look like a relaxing yoga retreat. So, as you nestle deeper under your covers and imagine yourself in this strange, class-locked world, remember, in the Victorian era, being in the wrong place at the wrong time or in the wrong hat could leave you out in the eternal London rain, if not worse. Next time someone suggests you'd have loved the dresses, ask them if they're prepared to memorize 100 pages of etiquette or dodge the stray chamber pot. Having to know your place was less about dignity and more like walking a tightrope in a hurricane, where the only safety net was knowing precisely who you weren't. If you survived even one day without being called out, snubbed, or quietly demoted, honestly, I'd like to hire you as my Victorian etiquette coach. Because, let's face it, this was a world where every glance, every greeting, and every crumb on your coat was a test, and losing meant more than an embarrassing oops. Drifting deeper, you realize that fashion is less about looking good and more like signing up for an extreme sport Victorian style. By now, your torso is laced into something that feels suspiciously like a boa constrictor with a grudge. Welcome to the world of the corset, one of history's most relentless inventions. The Victorians believed a small waist was the epitome of sophistication, but let's be honest, you're just concerned with breathing at this point. As you fidget under those unyielding whalebone stays, you're suddenly grateful for every hoodie you've ever owned. Historians still argue whether the tight-lacing trend was mostly self-imposed or a social expectation rammed down from the tippy top of the fashion food chain. Some suggest that women wore looser corsets for comfort at home, sort of like athleisure, but with 400% more boning. Then, when heading out for that all-important garden stroll, the lacing gets yanked as tight as a jar of pickles at a county fair, which, by the way, you probably wouldn't even be able to open anymore, given your restricted range of motion. Let's talk numbers, since nothing lulls a person to sleep like Victorian mathematics. At the peak of corset mania, waists could be cinched down to 18 inches or less. For reference, that's about the width of your average laptop yays. You could balance your MacBook on your lap as a handy reference while slowly losing the feeling in your legs. But don't think the fashionable torment ends there. Over your corset sits the next challenge, the crinoline. Imagine a gigantic steel cage petticoat designed to make your skirt flare out like a bell. The idea was to look dainty, feminine, and let's be honest, take up more space at the dinner table than anyone else. One quirky tidbit. There are stories of women accidentally knocking over vases, lamps, or occasionally small pets with their crinolines. Historians still argue whether the design was a covert Victorian strategy to keep men at arm's length, or just a misguided attempt to air out the lower half. So, here you are, squeezed at the waist, encircled by what amounts to a portable birdcage, and worrying about the logistics of fitting through doorways. It turns out group hugs are extremely rare in this world, not for lack of affection, but because, well, crinolines have a wicked wingspan. You might as well install a blimp warning light on your skirt. And as you shuffle through the parlour, you remember, fashion is pain. Sometimes literal pain, like fainting fits after stair climbing, or the horror of coughing in public and wondering if your ribs might snap. For the bold, there are tales possibly exaggerated of reshaped organs and even occasional fatalities attributed to tight lacing. Historians, always ready to stir the pot, still argue whether these health scares were blown out of proportion, perhaps the Victorian version of internet clickbait. Still, you probably won't be tempted to tighten the laces any further, unless you were hoping to outdo Queen Victoria herself and risk a spot in the day's medical journals. No, you're beginning to see why modern pajamas have a certain timeless appeal. And as you imagine yourself trying to snag a nap in all this get-up, you realise, in the battle of bedtime versus bodice, flannel always wins. So, you're standing in a Victorian bedroom, the candlelight flickering off porcelain dolls and high-backed furniture, when you finally find your way to what sort of, maybe, resembles a bathroom. And instantly, your hope for a comforting hot shower slips away like a bar of homemade, questionably scented soap. Because here's the reality check. In the grand, hygienic tradition of the era, you're not getting a steamy cascade at the twist of a knob. Nope. Victorians are all about the ritual of the washstand basin, pitcher, possibly a rag sitting demurely in the corner. Hot running water? That's basically science fiction. The wealthiest households, sure, might boast a languid copper bath, but unless you're lucky enough to be part of the 1%, and why would you be, when this timeline clearly wants to see you sweat, the actual process involves someone, often a servant, hauling bucket after buckethiated painstakingly over a coal fire from kitchen to tub. By the time your refreshing bath is ready, the water's tepid at best, and everyone in the house is annoyed with you. Historians still argue whether the weekly bath was a symbol of upper-class snobbery or simply the only way to bear the humiliation of being wait for it British in August. Back then, most people bathed only once a week, sometimes less, and tried to sponge away the worst of it in between. You, spoiled by the luxury of razor-sharp water pressure and a reliable thermostat, are probably beginning to understand why so much cologne, musky pomade, and even little bundles of dried lavender were necessary accessories. Hey, if you can't beat the body odor, try to distract from it with a personal cloud of odor anything but me. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Victorians didn't just avoid hot showers because of limited technology. Hot water was sometimes seen as dangerous. There was concern it might open up the pores too much, allowing sickness to slip in. So, the chill of your morning face wash is official medical advice. You can practically hear your grandma's voice in the background. A little cold water builds character. Sure, Grandma. And don't get too used to privacy either. In cramped city apartments, entire families shared the same grime grey tub, adding buckets in shifts on bath night. The oldest, usually dad, got to go first. By the time it was your turn, the water was questionable at best, like soup. But let's not think about what kind. In country houses, it was polite, apparently, to leave your bath water for the next person. So if you think roommate life in the 2020s is rough, just imagine putting out a sign reading, "Please enjoy my lightly used, moderately warm bucket bath." Some intrepid souls avoided baths altogether, clinging to the belief that too much water on the body, hot or cold, could actually be fatal. You might run into Aunt Edith, who proudly never lets her skin see more than a damp cloth in her entire life. Victorian doctors sometimes encouraged dry washing, basically, a towel rub down, and if you're lucky, a sprinkle of toilet powder. Not the kind you flush, promise. It probably comes as no surprise that your fresh out of the shower skin routine is completely alien here. No foaming cleansers, no sea salt scrubs, no endless shelf of hydrating creams. Instead, maybe there's a dab of rose water, if you can afford it. Otherwise, it's hope for the best and mask the rest. Why bother being squeaky, clean really, when the streets outside are full of mud, soot, and, let's just call it, unexpected puddles? With all this in mind, you slump onto a creaky bed, already missing lingering hour-long showers and the blessed privacy of your own bathroom. Hope you brought your own towel, just not, a white one. You slouch a little further at the table, stomach grumbling, and glance around at your fellow diners. That is, if you're lucky enough to be eating in company and not stuck with your own sour thoughts and a slice of stale loaf. The family across from you, all tucked in stiff collars and petticoats, stoically down their servings with an air of resignation. No one's passing around salt shakers. That's still not standard fare. In fact, the spread before you looks suspiciously familiar. Didn't you see this same boiled mutton, potatoes, and bland bread just last night? And this morning? And wait, wasn't that last Tuesday's dinner too? You poke at your greyish piece of mutton with a fork. It's desperately in need of seasoning spices, cost a fortune, and pepper, well, that's a luxury your family's annual budget definitely did not approve. Victorian food, at least for most people, isn't about thrilling your palate so much as preventing your collapse en route to the workhouse. Meat is boiled until every last hint of flavour has vanished, and vegetables, they're not so much charmed with butter as they are gently haunted by its memory. You notice the bread. It's brown, dense and gritty, with a coarse texture that feels less like artisan rustic loaf, and more like, I got lost hiking and had to eat moss for survival. Did you know some bakers back then used alum or even ground chalk to bulk up the loaves? Historians still argue whether these improvements made Victorian bread more affordable or just more suitable for use in home renovations. Either way, you have to admit, it's taking more chewing than you expected. Don't worry, dentistry hasn't really taken off yet, so best of luck to your molars. Your eyes drift toward the vegetables. Potatoes feature in almost every meal, boiled into an atomic blandness that would make even the most disciplined carb lover weep. On good days, you might find turnips or carrots beside them, equally soft and colourless. There's not much crunch here, unless by crunch you mean a suspicious sandy texture that makes you question your life choices. Victorians had a strange love affair with suet puddinga, boiled concoction of beef, fat, flour, and whatever sad scrapings you could toss in. It looks exactly as delicious as it sounds. There's a loud cough from the far end of the table, possibly someone choking on a bit of sinew, and you fight the urge to check if you're being filmed for an especially elaborate episode of Survivor, 19th century edition. Every so often, you'll hear a family member mention beef tea, the Victorian power drink. It's not nearly as exciting as the name implies. Beef tea is essentially hot water with a sliver of beef boiled in it, strained to an insipid broth that looks like watery sadness, sold as a miracle cure. Historians still argue whether it actually cured anyone, just made people appreciate water more. Let's not forget about the eggs. If you're lucky enough to find one that didn't get confiscated by your neighbour, it'll show up hard-boiled and cold, plopped unceremoniously atop your plate. You dip it in salt if you had salter, just try to swallow it without reflecting too much on flavour. There's chatter about tea at the meal's end, and you perk up finally, a momentary treat. But while coffee and tea are crowning glories of modern comfort, here they're rationed and often adulterated, the leaves reused for as many meals as possible. More than one Victorian would stretch their tea so far they'd be sipping on little more than beige-tinged disappointment by midweek. A sly cousin leans over and shares a secret. We used to steal the neighbour's marrow bones to make soup. You ever try marrow soup? Real Victorian delicacy. You try to picture this clutching bones, hunched over the stove, extracting the last vestiges of fat for flavour. Even the dog looks unimpressed. Historians still argue whether the Victorians' obsession with plain English food was a proud tradition, or simply a consequence of tight purse strings and terrible import logistics. Either way, you're starting to think flavour was outlawed somewhere in the 1800s. Suddenly, someone at the table tries to brighten the mood with a riddle. What smells worse than a fishmonger's apron and tastes worse than a week-old turnip? Answer: Monday's cold fried skate. Laughter erupts, the kind of laughter that says, if you don't laugh, you'll cry. You join in, but secretly you're eyeing the wilted cabbage, wondering if you can trade it for anything at all. Maybe even a subscription to a YouTube food channel. The cool spring air slips in from the cracked window, swirling around the dip in your mattress. You sigh, thinking if only a little fresh air could clear up your pounding headache. But here in this Victorian townhouse, remedies aren't as simple as water and a painkiller. You croak out your complaint to the lady of the house. Instantly, she's bustling over with, oh yes, a steaming cup of willow bark tea. Feels rustic, right? The herbal aroma is pleasant enough, but as you sip it, she tells you that this humble potion is what everyone took before aspirin was ever dreamed up. Historians still argue whether the soothing effects were more from the plant itself, or simply from believing hard enough that a bitter tea would help. I mean, if you want to cure a headache by gagging it into submission, who am I to judge? But maybe your problem isn't so minor. Earlier, the neighbour's son fell from a carriage, scraping a nasty gouge into his arm. Afternoon sunlight slants through the parlour windows where he sits, pale and trembling. With modern medicine, a few stitches, a clean bandage, and some antibiotics might be all he needs. In 1840, though, you'd reach for a bottle of carbolic acid if the doctor is up to date. Otherwise, the best you can hope for is a splash of rosewater and a rag that's technically been laundered this month. Now brace yourself, because this is where things get creative. The heroic treatments favoured by Victorian medicine would turn your stomach faster than an undercooked oyster. One favoured for nearly anything tuberculosis. Cough, heartbreak was opium. Yes, really. The stuff is lying in the top drawer, right by the knitting needles and a crumbling box of Turkish delight. In fact, you're as likely to get a dose of laudanum blend of opium and whinies you are a pat on the head. Choking down a syrupy teaspoonful with the little neighbour boy, you feel that floaty, slightly confused sensation moving through your bones. On the bright side, your headache is less of a problem. On the downside, you're not sure which century this is anymore. Somehow, Illness always seems to catch up with you at the least convenient time. Let's say you get a horrible sore throat. Today, you'd pop over to urgent care. Maybe leave with antibiotics or lozenges that taste like fake cherries. Instead, the family physician, who most recently delivered a baby and also bathed a neighbor's cat, arrives in a swirl of black wool. He pulls a dulled, curved tool from his bag, a tongue depressor fashioned from bone. After peering into your mouth, he prescribes gargling a mixture of vinegar, alum, and, for good measure, a dash of dried toad. Yes, apparently amphibian seasoning was all the rage for warding off evil humors. Historians still argue whether these recipes relieved pain or simply distracted you by being so repulsive. Even the basics can trip you up. The classic Victorian cure for fever? Bundle up under 3 heavy blankets, sweat it out, and absolutely, positively avoid fresh air unless you want to catch your death. Sorry about those complaints you just made about the window breeze. Murmurs travel down the hall about a newfangled tonic in the general store, patent medicine, guaranteed to fix the vapors, headaches, gout, and possibly your love life. Spoiler: it's mostly alcohol, flavored with licorice root and a generous pinch of hope. Dinner conversation turns to bizarre home remedies. One aunt swears by bladinga practice that was already falling out of favor, but not fast enough. Fancy a slice in your arm to rebalance the humors? The old barber's razors are in the cabinet, dulled but still hungry. Yet another swears by inhaling the steam from heated turpentine. If the fumes don't cure what ails you, at least they'll leave you in a daze. Quieter members of the household mutter about the dangers of modern medicine. Their words, innovations like ether anesthesia and germ theory, sound suspicious, even almost unholy. Never mind that Joseph Lister is out there lecturing that dirt actually causes infection. Historians still argue whether average households actually trusted these wild ideas or just preferred the predictability of superstition. The world outside is perilous too. If your appendix flares, that's it. You're invited to a grueling operation conducted on the parlor table, with only a clean cloth to bite down on. Anesthetic might be ether, or it might be whiskey and a prayer. The odds? Well, let's say you'd have better chances picking the right card in a crooked shell game. You can't help but notice the sweetish, metallic tang in the house after someone falls ill. Disinfectants, when not expensive air, sometimes lime or ash, scattered liberally on floors or over wounds. Even so, illness lingers, and the phrase hospital fever is whispered with dread. As night falls, you listen closely to the scraping of horse hooves and the distant chime of church bells. You picture how precarious every Victorian day truly is, where any ordinary slip might lead straight to the medicine chest and good luck surviving what comes out of it. So, as you roll over, the quilt heavy on your body and the window rattling beyond, you can't help but feel both lucky and uneasy. Modern medicine might have its complaints, but at least your cold won't be chased away with a jar of leeches or a too eager bottle of laudanum. As the darkness outside slowly begins to settle, you're still shuffling over cobbles slick with last night's rain, the squelch of your too thin boots echoing down cramped alleys. By now, if you've even made it to this point, your fingers are numb, and there's a faint ache blossoming at the base of your spine from hefting heavy baskets or pulling carts. Remember that cheeky boast you made at breakfast about surviving anything? Yeah, right about now, you're questioning every life choice that landed you here. Welcome to what many Victorians called a good, honest day's labour. Honest? Probably. Good? Well, let's just say the term is flexible, depending on whether you're the one working or the one writing in a cosy study about how industrious the lower classes are. Your shift could easily start before the first rays of sun slip between chimney pots. Once, Maybe you might have watched a single candle gutter in your cramped room, the smell of tallow and damp stone mixing in your nose as you dressed in yesterday's ragged shirt. By now, you know that the young workday isn't a cute rarity, just the default. Even the word childhood doesn't mean what it does for you. In factories, down narrow mine shafts, and deep inside stifling textile mills, child labour is not an exception but a norm. And it's not just boys. Girls, often younger, sometimes as little as 5 or 6, carry bobbins as big as their heads across endless floors, eyes red from lint and shrieking looms. There are some laws, sure, those famous factory acts, but ink only dries so fast, and bosses have a way of squinting at regulation if your hands are small enough to clear a jammed loom. Historians still argue whether the law truly made kids' lives safer, or if it just made parents and factory owners better at fudging ages and greasing palms. You might be stationed as a piecer, trailing behind titanic machines with quickness and, let's face it, pure terror. One wrong step, and snap fingers caught, clothes dragged, a day's wage lost in a blink, or something much worse. There are stories, fringe details really, that parents use to lock in children with heavy boots to keep the youngest from running off during an all-night spinning bee. Hey, nothing says family values like a padlock and a pep talk. The air stings with the tang of metal and dust laced with chemical dyes, which is a great way to turn a white handkerchief blue just by blowing your nose, assuming you still have anything left up there. Lunch break rolls around, if you're lucky. More often, you hunch near a broken window, gnawing on a heel of old bread, sharing jokes with the other kids. Maybe you joke about getting a raise. The punchline is that, no, that's not happening. For entertainment, some boys sneak outside and try to catch a rat, not as a pet, but as proof for betting games on the biggest tail or ugliest teeth. Loser has to sweep the boss's office. If you tell any of this to grown-ups later, you're called cheeky at best, and at worst, given a warning to shut it, or you'll be scrubbing floors twice as long tomorrow. You're starting to realize how carefully every step is measured in such a place, not for fun or curiosity, but just to survive until coal black dusk. People then don't talk about burnout. They talk about weathering through and hoping for Sunday. Imagine explaining mental health days to your Victorian foreman. He'd probably look at you with a mixture of confusion, suspicion, and envy before handing you a mop. Rumours swirl around every corner sometimes. The supervisors track productivity so closely they'll dock anyone who seems slow, even if you're just catching your breath. Occasionally, a kindly overseer will pass you a boiled potato, and for a second, you almost forget the ache in your feet. Almost. But your job, like your shirt, never quite fits right. And if you slip up, maybe a grown-up with a switch is ready to teach you a lesson. That lesson: don't get caught showing weakness. Sometimes you sneak glances at the world outside through sooty windows, dreaming that it's a bit brighter elsewhere. Newsflash, it usually isn't. There are stories tucked into the spaces between these work days of children growing up fast, which you now realize mostly means trading hopes for bread and daydreams for survival instincts. The factory whistle becomes both your alarm clock and your lullaby, an ever-present soundtrack, almost daredevil in its monotony. Sometimes you find yourself humming along, finding rhythm in the repetitiveness, because complaining just means work is harder tomorrow. You wouldn't last, and that's okay, nobody was meant to. Just like your bread crusts, you scrape by. So, as your eyes are getting heavier, and the memory of bone-aching Victorian exhaustion starts to fade into your dreamscape, give yourself a little gratitude for your pillow, and maybe, just maybe, remember that not so long ago, being tough was about so much more than just making it to Friday. Windows rattle as a fresh gust of London wind whistles in, stirring the heavy drapes, and you press your chilled hands into your lap, still thinking about that trip to the headsman's block from last time. But let's not forget, harsh punishments in Victorian life didn't always mean you were carted off to the gallows. Sometimes, the reality was more mundane and, somehow, more humiliating. Picture this. You're a school kid, yes, still in your itchy uniform, and your only crime is daydreaming out the window. Or maybe you scrawl a sarcastic doodle in your copybook, poking fun at your stern teacher's mutton chop sideburns. It's enough to get you summoned to the front of the classroom, where, with grim ceremony, the master brings out the cane. That's right. In the Victorian era, corporal punishment isn't just the norm, it's an art form. The classic, 6 of the best, lashes to your palmone for each rebellion you wish you'd left unsaid. Your classmates wince in sympathy, eyes wide, but you have no choice but to steel yourself and take it. Historians still argue whether fear or respect fueled these traditions. But you know one thing: modern detention suddenly seems like a tropical vacation. It isn't only schools, though. The streets themselves are patrolled by authority. Steal a loaf of bread, because let's face it, you're still hungry from last night's bland gruel, and public humiliation awaits. Stocks remain on street corners, as old-fashioned as they are effective. Here's the quirky part nobody tells you in Marvel movies. People in the stocks become local entertainment. Passers-by might toss rotten vegetables or the occasional cold cabbage at your exposed head, or simply laugh while you contemplate your poor life decisions. You desperately hope your crush isn't walking by, but let's be honest, this is your luck. Even small domestic mishaps, maybe you track mud into Mrs. Puddlewick's parlour while delivering coal can, earn a punishment from your employer. Servants suffer their own brand of justice, withheld wages, meagre meals, or long lectures delivered with maximum eyebrow archness. If your boss is especially dramatic, and, in this city, who isn't, you could find yourself dismissed with no referencer social death sentence. That means no honest employer will hire you again. Historians still argue whether these measures built character or just kept everyone terrified enough not to rebel. Want something a bit weirder? Well, for certain crimes, the Victorians loved what was called the rough music treatment. Get caught bickering too loudly with your spouse or mismanaging your debts, and the neighbours might gather outside your window. There, they'd bang pots and pans, hoot, and sing rude rhymes about your misfortune, kind of like a mob version of bad Yelp reviews, but with more cowbell. Social media drama, meet 1,850's surround sound. Of course, some authorities believed a little time out was good for the Sula stint in solitary at the workhouse, or, if your offence was more serious, on the dreaded treadmill in prison. Not a peloton, mind you. A giant groaning wheel you climb for hours, producing absolutely nothing but sweat and sore feet. The theory was hard labour would prompt introspection. What it usually produced, realistically, was blisters and an allergy to authority. You might be wondering, did anyone ever question all this? Well, yes, actually. Late in the era, campaigners started to complain about the cruelty of these punishments. Debates raged in stuffy parlours and parliament benches alike. Was caning a moral necessity or mere brutality? Should the birch be retired next to powdered wigs? Historians still argue whether these reforms made things gentler or just pushed punishment behind closed doors out of sight, but not, let's face it, out of mind. And if you thought this was the realm of the poor, think again. Even the upper crust weren't immune to society's harsh corrections. Step out of line at a tea party, get too friendly with the butler, or wear last year's hat, and your social circle might quietly ice you out. That's rhitostracism, the coldest punishment of all, and not a heated blanket in sight. You're starting to see why one wrong move could mean a very, very long day in Victorian Britain. But even as you rub your imaginary knuckles and dust off cabbage leaves from your shoulder, you can't help but wonder which is worse, public ridicule or that never-ending treadmill, or perhaps being on the receiving end of rough music with your neighbours singing "There's no loyalty in laundry" is truly the low point. But hey, at least nobody's live streaming it yet. Maybe just this once. Your grateful modern punishments are limited to missing dessert or horror of horrors losing Wi-Fi for the night. But don't close your eyes just yet, because the story is about to get even stranger. After all, nothing says Victorian hospitality quite like a zero-tolerance rulebook and a wardrobe full of consequences. The evening draws on, and you've finally finished a full day of Victorian life, trudging along cobbled streets, dodging horse-drawn carriages, and contending with more soot than a modern-day barbecue pitmaster. The sky is inky, the chill seeps in, and you would dearly love nothing more than to flop on the settee and switch on your favourite Netflix show, maybe even scroll absent-mindedly through TikTok until your eyelids drift shut. But remember, there's no TV, no internet, not even a suspiciously fuzzy late-night infomercial. You eye the family hearth with the same suspicion you'd give a pop-up ad. The options, quite frankly, are bleak. Read by flickering candlelight. Hello, eye strain. Play dominoes with Aunt Winifred for the 43rd time in a row. Or simply imagine the horror. Talk to the other people in your house. Victorian evenings, it turns out, last a very long time. In a world dictated by sunrise and sunset, night looms larger than your used tono glowing screens, no notification buzzes. The only thing trending here is, well, tuberculosis. Want to binge something? Try a serialized penny dreadful. But, fair warning, you'll wait a week for each new chapter, and spoiler alerts haven't yet been invented. Historians still argue whether this slow-drip storytelling stoked creativity or just led to a lot of frustrated cliffhanger-induced hair loss. Either way, you'd swap your left sock for a remote control. But here's a mainstream fact. The idea of prime-time television doesn't even exist. After dinner, upper-crust Victorian families retire to the drawing room for parlour amusements, dramatic readings of poetry. Anyone? Board games like Snakes and Ladders debut in this era as much-needed boredom fighters, though you do have to admit the Victorian version has a lot more morality lessons and far fewer rubber snakes. If you're well off, maybe someone clinks out a Beethoven sonata on the upright, and everyone tries very hard to look deeply moved, at least until someone's stomach accidentally rumbles. By now, you're noticing just how much time you once filled effortlessly with the internet's bottomless buffet of memes, reaction GIFs, and cat videos. With none of that, Victorians come up with creative alternatives. It might just be charades, or if you're in London, and feeling adventurousa, late stroll through a near-deserted park, muffled in fog and the occasional, terrifyingly loud sound of your own boots. Quirky tidbit? There are reports of families literally inventing secret parlour languages just to spice up long, monotonous winter evenings. I mean, desperate times call for desperate conversation gambits. At this point, you try reading aloud, because people actually do that for fun in the 19th century. Dickens himself published serial installments of novels, and crowds would gather at night to listen, sometimes weeping, sometimes gasping, along with each chapter's big reveal. Imagine the anticipation. No clickbait thumbnails, just pure storytelling, one sentence at a time. On the plus side, Spoilers could only travel as fast as your neighbor's ability to yell over the backyard fence. It's dark outside, so dark that peeking through the window is half horror movie, half ASMR, no streetlights flickering on. If you live in a posher area, a lamplighter might shuffle past, lighting gas lamps one by one. Otherwise, it's darkness so thick you'd think you'd accidentally closed your eyes. There's a debate even among scholars about whether the lack of artificial light made people more imaginative or just grumpier. My money's on grumpier, with bonus night terrors. If things get really dire, and you live in the city, maybe you can convince someone to play the mouth harper, for a real thrill. Maybe read that one shocking review from the penny illustrated paper about the latest stage magician. You won't understand a thing, of course. The vocabulary feels like you're trying to decipher a text message sent by your great-great-great-grand-dunkle. You're yawning by now. It's not the endearing, gentle drift towards sleep that you get after finishing a season finale. Either it's the bone-deep fatigue of someone who has spent an entire evening trying to fill the silence. Parlor games, public readings, board games, maybe a bit of awkward dancing if there's a cousin who refuses to let the piano collect dust for one blessed night. You start to see why people were rumored to go to bed at 8:30 p.m. There's only so much parlor amusement a person can take without risking existential crisis. There's a certain romance to the idea, of course. Candlelight flickering in a room full of strange Victorian upholstery, the gentle tap of rain on the window, the tang of smoke curling from the chimney. But even with all that, the novelty wears off after 3 rounds of charades and a hymn sung so off-key, the family dog whimpers under the settee. No TikTok, no YouTube, no texting your friends about how hard the boredom is hitting. The night stretches on, and if it weren't for the comfort of a thick blanket and the persistent hope of dreaming about literally anything else, you might just combust from sheer ennui. Still, you can almost hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, marking each minute like a challenge. Could you really do this, if you had to? Could you last a full day a night without a single meme? And tomorrow, well, you'll be right here again, maybe slightly better at dominoes, or knitting, or assembling all your pent-up restlessness into a full-on dramatic reading of Hamlet. Good luck, Victorian you. You pause at the top of a narrow, creaking staircase, the ornate carpet brushing against your slippered feet. You can't remember if it's 3 steps up and a pause, or 3 steps up and a proper bow, before someone of higher status. These rules are enough to turn anyone's brain to pudding. Someone nearby clears their throat with a practiced subtlety that's honestly more intimidating than a shouting drill sergeant. You realize with a lurch of panic that you've forgotten your handkerchief yet again. Because in this household, every polite cough or accidental sneeze is to be disguised behind a perfect, freshly pressed square of linen, preferably monogrammed. Even during meals, the etiquette continues, swirling around your head like a swarm of well-dressed bees. You can't simply eat when you're hungry. No, you wait to be seated by rank. You unfold your napkin with just the right flick of your wrist, and heaven forbid your soup spoon make a single splash. In the presence of boiled beef and aspic, even the most determined modern foodie might lose their appetite. Historians still argue whether more Victorians died from stern social anxiety than actual bad Victorian recipes, and frankly, you're starting to see their point. At the dinner table, you face a barrage of rules that would make even a computer programmer groan. Forks on the left, knives on the right, but only pick them up with the correct hand. Conversation is permitted, but not too loud, not too silly, and never, ever about unpleasant things like politics, money, or, bodily functions. You try to compliment the cooked cabbage, but apparently you've used the wrong adjective. Pleasant is far too familiar. You should have said satisfactory, as per the lady of the house's standards. There's a reason Victorians could sniff out impoliteness like bloodhounds with top hats. You watch the servants glide around, silent as moths, pouring tea into bone china cups. You'd love a cuppa, but alas, there's a ritual for that too. First, you wait for the hostess to signal tea time. Next, you accept your cup with a gentle thank you, never thanks, never cheers, and absolutely not tar. Tea should be sipped, not slurped. And if you dare raise your pinky, that's a myth, you'll be told, invented much later for a giggle at Victorian expense. Still, the ghost of etiquette hovers at your elbow, scolding you into lowering any stray digits. A friend, new to the family, once fumbled this dance disastrously by sitting before everyone else had taken their seat. The resulting shockwave of disapproval could have powered half of London. As a quirky historical tidbit, there was once a family in 1874 who held practice suppers with fake food to rehearse the correct order of operations before hosting guests. It was like dinner theatre for the socially terrified. Your mind is starting to fizz with rules. Don't point, don't shout, don't cross your legs unless you're a man, but not too boldly. And whatever you do, don't forget to say please and thank you to everyone, even the cat, if she decides to grace you with a withering glance. The world outside might be whizzing toward modernity, but inside these wallpapered parlours, time stands stubbornly still. Historians still argue whether all of this served to keep society in order, or just gave upper-class families something mutually exhausting to bond over. By now, you might be longing for a quieter space, maybe a place where you can just for a moment slouch in your chair, yawn without fear, or eat a sandwich with your hands. But no, there are still parlours to visit, hands to kiss, and if you're feeling ambitious, napkins to fold into ever more elaborate shapes. Just remember, blink twice for help. Filthy air clawing at your lungs as you shuffle forward, imagining yourself as just another figure in this smog-soaked cityscape. By now, after everything you've endured, the subtle hope that things can't get worse has probably slunk off to hide. Spoiler, it absolutely can, thanks to the Victorian city's truly epic collection of smog and dirty streets. Tonight, you're not walking on clean flagstones or gliding through neatly kept parks. No, blink and open your eyes. You're plodding along a cramped thoroughfare under that infamous pea soup fog. The gaslight overhead throws ghostly halos through the air, but the glow barely penetrates. Sulphurous haze clings to your coat. Your boots squelch into a mix of ashes, muck, and, well, let's politely call it organic runoff. You try to hold your breath, but good luck within seconds. The stinging soot finds your nose, your throat, right down to the bottom of your lungs. Now, let's face it, you've heard about Victorian filth, but you probably pictured a touch of grime and maybe a whiff of horse. Reality check this is an ecosystem of pollution. By the late 1800s, cities like London were running on coal in fireplaces, coal for factory chimneys, coal fueling chimneys in every home, and coal powering those heavy, clattering trains echoing through the night. The byproduct? A permanent atmospheric soup. And here's the thing. Historians still argue whether Victorian smog counts as air or just bad soup. In December of 1873, and again in infamous 1892, especially in the East End, people simply didn't leave their houses for days. If you braved it outside, you'd use a thick scarf, maybe even a handkerchief soaked in vinegar to help filter the air. Otherwise, coughing fits and stinging eyes would greet you at every step. What's that? You forgot your vinegar scarf? Classic rookie move. You try to take shelter in a side alley, but surprises abound. A stream of questionable water cuts a neat little rivulet down the cobblestones. It's not artful city planning, it's yesterday's rain, this morning's wash water, and, for all you know, someone's chamber pot, all in one. Here's your quick quiz for bedtime. Are those soft lumps your sidestepping horse droppings, piles of cinders, or parts from an impromptu street soup? Trick question. It's all three. And if you think you're clever skating by the puddles, it's all slick for a reason. Take a second to listen. That's not gentle white noise. It's the horse-drawn omnibuses rumbling past, punctuated by the frantic barks of costermongers hawking turnips and fish. Every wheel pounds dust into the air, mixing with soot and all that glorious manure. By the way, horses are modest compared to the human element you're sharing the road with Victorian residents who, when pressed, treat public streets as an extension of their own rather limited living space. Your throat tightens as you try to remember the vinegar scarf. It's suddenly looking fashionable, and if you shudder at catching a plague or three just from strolling, you're not alone. Mainstream historians will tell you that diseases like cholera and diphtheria had a real field day with these conditions. Less mainstream, but infinitely more entertaining. There are stories of city-dwelling cats developing a distinctive soot sneeze, so blackened by the air that people joked about finding coal in their fur. Of course, disputes rage in obscure corners of the academic world about whether it was the coal smog or just terrible sanitation that triggered the worst outbreaks. Chalk it up to both. Really a real dynamic duo of doom. But here's another facepalm. By 1890, doctors reported treating patients for urban pneumonia, a kind of lung burnout from breathing this toxic stew. Let's wander a bit further, if you can still see your hand in front of you. The city's poor are huddled in doorways, wrapping threadbare shawls around their faces not for modesty, but because the air literally hurts. You spot a group of children scraping at the curb with stick scavenging for morsels, coal chips, or anything that can be burned for a trace of warmth. Some of these little scavengers even become amateur mudlarks, combing the Thames for valuables and earning perhaps the most questionable badge of environmental bravery you can imagine. Let's not pretend the city council is blissfully unaware, by the way. In the 1850s, London tried to clear the fog with giant fans, and one especially hopeful inventor proposed a smog vacuum. Imagine a 100-foot-long Hoover trundling down the street. Never caught on, for some mysterious reason. It's not like they thought to just burn less coal. But optimism is free. And if you have any romantic notions left, Victorian novels, mysterious gaslight, Sherlock Holmes striding through the mist, hold on to them, but just know that fog was infamous for swallowing people whole. During the Great Smog, even carriages crashed. The city's life slowed to a lurching, hacking crawl, and people reportedly walked into the Thames by accident. Yes, the fog was that thick and navigation that challenging. By the end of a single evening, your skin feels grimy, your breath comes in shallow, wheezy gulps, and you're starting to picture yourself as one of those urban ghosts haunting the city Scapino among the living, but never quite at rest. At least you'll have plenty of fellow ghosts for company. Sleep tight. Your daily routine on horseback is almost laughably exhausting by now. And if we're being honest, you spend these long hours swaying in your terribly rigid saddle, daydreaming about cruise control or heated seats, or even, seat belts that aren't a single hopeful strip of leather. By the 12th excruciating hour, you're starting to wonder if the horse feels just as betrayed by your presence as you do by its insistence on eating every tuft of grass along the roadside. The miles creep by beneath iron-shod hooves, each one settling deeper into your aching bones. Sometimes a carriage rattles past, the passengers peeking at you with a look that says, "Bless your heart," Victorian code for, "Why on earth are you still riding like a peasant?" Maybe you'd hitch a ride. Except history tells us that not all carriages are created equal. In 1873, the omnibuses trundled through London's streets, basically public transport. Only the seats are so hard they could double as punishment stools. Imagine the joy of finally hopping into one, only to find an entire row of passengers sneezing directly onto your lapel, courtesy of one of those legendary city fogs, the kind that historians still argue whether they were more smog, soot, or just collective human exhalation. Of course, not every rider sticks to the main road. The British countryside in the late 1800s is a crusty mosaic of muddy lanes, bramble-choked borders, and the sort of potholes that could swallow your entire horse if you look away long enough. You notice sometimes a mail coach lumbering past on its way from London to Bristol. Turns out, these Victorian mailmen are the cowboys of their day, famous for braving storms, highwaymen, and worst of all, the Royal Mail timetables. There's actually a quirky anecdote about a coachman named Quicksilver. He carried the King's Post with such speed that it was rumoured his moustache fluttered to a point. But then, historians still argue whether Quicksilver was a real man or just a marketing ploy designed to shame slow mail carriers and sell more tickets. The Victorians absolutely loved a good branding tactic, which is probably why you keep seeing handbills advertising the swiftest gentle ride to Bath guaranteed, less than 3 breakdowns a week. By this point, there's no denying you envy literally anyone with a better mode of transportation. Even the traffic police, known as peelers, get to stand around at the busiest intersections of London, looking very important while mostly herding carts and the occasional runaway chicken. Sometimes you hear them blowing their shrill whistle-seach blast, echoing off the cobblestones over, clattering hooves and shouts from irritated drivers. The genuine chaos is enough to make parallel parking look like an Olympic sport. Victorians themselves tended to avoid direct confrontation. Instead, they devised intricate hand signals and used canes partly for style, partly to make their displeasure known from a safe distance. There's even an unofficial code about tipping your hat at precisely the right angle, but historians still argue whether this stopped cart collisions or just encouraged an epidemic of whiplash. All along the way, unfamiliar sounds and smells ambush you. The leather of your borrowed boots squeaks with every jostle. Your own horse gives a dramatic huff when you accidentally nudge it the wrong way, refusing to cooperate unless bribed with yet another apple filched from a conveniently low-hanging branch. And if you pause near any village inn, the stable hands compete to share stories about travellers lost in the bogs outside, toner warning, and perhaps a little darkly comedic encouragement to tip generously if you ever want to see your horse again. You never realise how menacing an 11-year-old stable boy can look until he's holding your only ride by the reins and asks far too nicely if you'd prefer the express cleaning. Occasionally, you cross a stone bridge guarded by none other than a toll keeper, notorious for their unwavering commitment to extracting a penny for passage even from royalty. The truly unlucky traveller forgets their pocket change and faces the mortifying ordeal of bargaining with a man whose entire job is to never, under any circumstances, let anyone pass without a toll. It's said, in one particularly odd tidbit, that some toll keepers trained the local geese to honk menacingly at would-be freeloader riders. The Victorian Era, where even the farm animals side-eye your finances. After another hour clinging to the fading sunlight, the notion creeps in that you'd happily trade all your future smartphone upgrades for a single, cozy Uber. Too bad. The closest thing to carpooling is either squeezing into a private coach, if you can pay for it, or mingling with strangers on a communal cart, where the only air conditioning is someone else's newspaper fanning yesterday's fish and chips smell into your face. Not exactly the dream. Still, you make progress. Horses may be slow, but there's a raw, clumsy satisfaction when you finally spot the smokestacks of your destination in the distance. With sore legs, rain-soaked sleeves, and a new appreciation for every modern convenience you left behind, you haven't quite broken down yet. But as another cartwheel splashes a generous spray of cold mud over your boots, even you have to laugh. After all, as you remember the "you probably won't survive this" warning from our journey's start, you realize by Victorian standards you've outlasted the odds by simply not passing out in a ditch. And come to think of it, the horse seems mildly impressed. Or is it just hungry? Hard to say. Historians still argue whether that sideways stare is admiration or just wishful thinking for a break. Maybe by now you've realized that bundling up in scratchy woolens and accepting the ever-present chill just comes with the territory. But let's not skip over one uniquely Victorian challenge: sleep itself. You pull the coarse blankets tighter, but the cold has a talent for finding your toes anyway, creeping through the seams of your nightshirt and hovering over bare floorboards. Every creak and groan of the hawser knot, to mention the wind shuttling right under the doorframe, reminds you that central heating isn't just missing, it hasn't even been dreamed up. Sleep feels less like drifting off in cozy contentment and more like an act of heroic endurance. That's because in most Victorian homes, the only warmth came from a fading fireplace hours away from your bed, or maybe a ceramic bed warmer, if you were lucky enough to own one. It's a quirky slice of history. People would fill glazed stoneware bottles with hot water, or, if you're feeling adventurous or have no sense of smell, smouldering coals. Tucked these into bed before climbing in, even if you just sent your younger sibling as tribute to test the water temperature, in case it cracked open and turned your blanket into a marsh. Safety standards, Victorians might have said, blinking in confusion. Historians still argue whether those bed warmers did more harm than good, setting beds alight, perhaps more often than they helped. If you had to rely on smouldering coals, you'd be gambling between warm toes and a midnight house fire. It's the ultimate choose-your-own adventure, Victorian style. And let's be honest, at this hour, faced with numb feet and the darkness breathing frost across your pillow, you start wishing for something as simple as a thermostat. It didn't help that proper air was a Victorian obsession. Even in winter, many Victorians believed that circulating night air was healthier than stifling rooms, so you might find a little window propped open with a matchbox. A recipe for optimal respiratory health, more likely for waking up with icicles where your nose used to be. You sigh and burrow even further. Stories float around of icy chamber pots freezing shut overnight, or family members doing a panicked dance around the hearth before dashing into icy sheets, an early prototype of the Olympic sprint, if you will. And you thought your Monday mornings were rough. Modern historians occasionally quibble over how the Victorians reconciled this daily discomfort with their strict moral codes and routine schedules. Were those bleary-eyed workers stumbling to the factory line genuinely hardier, or just quietly shivering in resignation until the morning shift bell? The answer probably depends on which grumpy descendant you ask. Either way, you look around, feeling the dampness soak through your socks, and realize there's one thing the Victorians were truly experts at: pretending they weren't freezing to death. And as your eyes finally flutter shut, you try to channel a little of that legendary British stoicism, knowing tomorrow the chill will still be waiting, right where you left it. You shuffle on, numb with ache and exhaustion because, let's face it, you are operating here on fumes and the faint hope that sleep might someday make a comeback. The sun is going down, but that doesn't mean your work is done. Not in a place where heavy workloads is an insultingly mild way to describe the back-breaking, soul-wearying glut of duties heaved atop your tiny Victorian frame. No, at this hour, your shift just sort of morphs into another. You catch a glimpse of yourself in the grimy shop window, hands grey with London soot, shadows beneath your eyes deep enough to store coal. Pretty terrifying, honestly. Side note, don't expect any fashionable makeup routines to save you here. Victorian cosmetics basically consisted of lead powder, arsenic, and hope. Not a winning combination for the modern influencer. At this point, you can barely lift your boots if you were lucky enough to own them in the first place. The cobblestones press with rude insistence through painfully thin soles. Across the street, a lamplighter bends his back, lifting that long pole to spark another gaslight to life. He's on his own punishing clock. One man, dozens of lamps, all before curfew. They say that during foggy London nights, some lamplighters tied little bells to themselves so people wouldn't walk directly into them. Is that true? Historians still argue whether the infamous London pea soup fogs really made people that blind, or if it's just another one of those quirky Victorian exaggerations, like calling a heart attack sudden demise due to vapours. Still, the idea of you ambling headfirst into a startled lamplighter does add a comedic element. You both tumble over and he's yelling about his last match, while you promise your boss you'll be back before the hour's out. It's slapstick, sure, but it's also a symptom of these endless, shapeless work days. You recall how much they expected from everyone, men, women, and children alike. Factory workers start before dawn, and if they're lucky, they finish when the bells ring, although sometimes the bells seem to toll only for someone else's freedom. Sometimes you'd see notices in the hallway, reminding you with grim precision, late arrivals will forfeit half a day's wage. Imagine that. You're running for your life to make shift. And for what? The grand privilege of using a communal outhouse that is definitely not up to code. Here's a fun tidbit. In Victorian times, at some factories, workers' bathroom breaks were tracked with little brass tokens. Lose your saw, take too long, docked pay, or even dismissal. Modern time clocking suddenly looks pretty humane, doesn't it? Anyway, all through these long days, you and all your fellow labourers walk around with this constant sense of just get through it. You eat whatever is left from the morning's cold, congealed porridge, and you count your coins literally, since pay is in actual shillings and farthings, and you never seem to have enough of either. Still, your mind wanders, even in this haze of repetition. Some of your friends are talking about the new half-day on Saturdays, this radical idea beginning to make waves among the more progressive employers. Wouldn't that be something? A half-day to yourself every week. Historians still argue whether labour movements or economics drove the eventual shift. Some say factory owners wanted to stave off strikes. Others that new machines simply made longer hours unnecessary. You suspect it was both and, maybe the kind of exhausted grumbling you're doing right now. And then, as you trudge home, your only solace is that one day, maybe not too many decades from now, people will be able to leave their work at the office. That they'll have weekends and get this actual paid holidays. But for now, you can only dream, and maybe let your mind drift to strange Victorian hobbies like knitting decorative cozies for your teapot or collecting beetles in glass cases. Some say Victorians had more leisure time than we think because of these odd hobbies, but honestly, you're too tired to even think of picking up a beetle, let alone arranging a whole collection. You pass by a few bakers' boys, just finishing their own marathon of errands. They're all sticky with sweat and flour, and one tries to crack a joke about never eating another crumpet again. You laugh, or at least make the sound you think laughter used to be, somewhere deep in the recesses of your mind where energy still lives. Hard to believe this is the daily grind for everyone. You wonder if you'll ever get used to it, or if you'll join the ranks of the dreamers, those who imagine a world with 8-hour days and free afternoons. Rest assured, you're not alone in this weariness, or in the hope that by the time dawn creeps over these dark rooftops, tomorrow might be just a little bit easier. But let's be honest, you probably wouldn't last another Victorian day without calling in sick, and even that wasn't a real option back then. So, with your last ounce of energy, you remind yourself, someday people will tell stories of these long days, of heavy workloads, of everyone carrying more than their share, only so that the future can be a little lighter. And maybe, just maybe, you'll be in one of those stories, too. Now, the rooms around you are quiet. Your blanket is just the right weight, and the air from the fan tickles your face, cool and gentle. You listen to this soft hum and imagine what this very moment would be like in, say, the heart of 19th century London. You're lying in bed, perhaps a straw-stuffed mattress, in a room full of lingering coal smoke, peppered with the sounds of creaking pipes and clattering horse carts from the muddy street. Your mind drifts back, comparing your cozy, modern night, your memory foam pillow, maybe a glass of water on your nightstand, and, of course, the faint glow of your phone versus a Victorian night spent trying not to cough up a lung from the fog, or worse, listening for the scurry of rats inside the walls. And even now, with all the gritty details you've imagined, there's still so much we take for granted. You unwind with a playlist, maybe a podcast Victorians. If you wanted music at bedtime, you needed actual people. And if you wanted a story, you relied on whoever could keep their eyes open through the smog. Did people ever get bored listening to stories by candlelight? Or were they too tired from, surviving? Historians still argue whether evening family time was cozy or more of an obligation, when all you wanted was to collapse after another day of hard labor and questionable hygiene. You picture yourself, resourceful as you are, trying to make the best of it. But honestly, would you have lasted even one day in Victorian life? Sure, you're resilient, but are you no hot water ever, chamber pot emptying, soot in every crevice resilient? Maybe, but only if your idea of fun is, how many different ways can I catch pneumonia tonight? By now, you've learned about the famous fog that was more like breathing from the exhaust pipe of a bus. And that same legendary London pea soup sometimes got so thick, even carriage drivers would walk at a crawl, lantern aloft, and pray they didn't run headlong into a lamppost. A mainstream fact? In 1873, the fog got so bad, people literally wandered into the Thames by accident. Fringe fact? The wealthiest Victorians sometimes brought entire trees indoors for Christmas, dripping with real candles, because what's better for fire safety than lots of open flame near your wallpaper paste and curtains? That one's straight out of the definitely do not try this at home category. Your thoughts drift to how the day would have ended in those times after managing the impossible list of daily chores. Maybe you'd have collapsed bone-weary, shivering in a bed piled with scratchy woolen blankets. No screens, no instant snacks, not even the simple pleasure of scrolling through your phone in the dark. The best technology for comfort was, if you were lucky, a hot brick wrapped in cloth, truly the height of spa treatments. And yet, there was a certain pride in adaptation, a kind of resilience built on persistence and a whole lot of stubbornness. Did people back then appreciate what little warmth, light, or comfort they had? Or did they just get used to doing without? You can almost hear the debate echo through time. In the long, inky silence, you realize historians still argue whether the challenge of daily survival bred uniquely strong communities or just a population of people who, frankly, had run out of energy to complain. Your appreciation for the ease of modern life feels so much deeper now. Every little thing, your clean water, your late-night snack cravings fulfilled, the lowest level of your climate-controlled room becomes a tiny marvel. Would you rather sleep knowing there's no risk of soot-black snot in the morning, or wake up mid-century style, wondering if today's breakfast was laced with a sprinkle of mysterious food dyes or, arsenic? Hey, it was almost always exciting. So as you drift towards sleep, warm, safe, and sooted, you've earned a fresh gratitude for all the small and enormous comforts of here and now. Your day might have felt long, but you didn't have to wrestle with corset strings, lye soap, or the existential dread of an indoor privy. And if you ever find yourself wishing you lived in a more charming era, maybe remember, you probably wouldn't have survived it, not with your love of running water and crime dramas. Count your blessings, and maybe hug your pillow a little tighter tonight even if it's not stuffed with horsehair. Good night, time traveler. Dream modern dream sand, remember. Sometimes the past is best left gently in the pages of history, or at least on the other side of your glowing screen. So here you are, lying back in the soft glow of your room, the outside world stilled and distant, the hum of your fan blending with your quiet thoughts. Let the visions of velvet fog and the clatter of iron-shod hooves begin to dissolve, like mist curling away from lamplit cobbles at the first blush of dawn. Imagine the chill lifting from those ancient streets, replaced by the gentle warmth gathered beneath your own blanket, every rough edge of the past smoothing itself out as you take a deep breath, letting go of the smog, the soot, and the rattle of horse-drawn carriages. Picture your room becoming softer, the echoes of footsteps, laughter, and faraway church bells now muted, then fading altogether. Even the prickly memories of scratchy wool blankets or the haunting, distant whistles of factory steam fade into nothing, replaced by the tranquility of this present moment. Your breath moves in and out, slow and easy, carrying you away from the weight and weariness of Victorian days. No burdens to shoulder, no curfews to race, just the feather-light hush of now. If you listen closely, all that remains is a gentle hush, a whisper that curls around you like the softest quilt, drawing you closer to rest. There is no more need to remember rules or rehearse careful etiquette, no more gaslight or muddy puddles. It's only you and the quiet, and the safe comfort that waits as you drift towards sleep. In your dreams, let the past step gently aside, making space for stories lighter than air and wishes brighter than any candle ever burned. You are home, you are warm, and you are free to float into the gentlest, deepest sleep, far from all the shadows and soot of history. End of story. Have a sweet dreams.